It was the sort of showdown that might have taken place in the Dodge City of old. The Dodge City treasured by Hollywood and recalled in authentic detail in the Boot Hill Museum, just off Wyatt Earp Boulevard, except, of course, for the presence of the Chevy Blazer. Trying to describe the Blazer more precisely some months later, Terry Malone, the county attorney of Ford County, said, "It was a Blazer at one time." A truck that had survived the 70s, it had been modified for off-road, four-wheel driving. Its owner, a young man named Tanner Brunson, spent a lot of time working on trucks. On his Facebook page, he had described himself this way. "I'm 20 years old. I live in Dodge City. I'm 6'3", 185 pounds, in great shape. I love to be outside, working on my truck and certain new shit. I am working on Amy S10 right now, misspellings. It's an 86 Chevy short bed extended cab with a 383 stroker pushing around 450 horsepower with a TH200 tranny with 2800 stall and shift kit. It'll do a 2-block burn. Out. I'm working on my traction problem right now. Lots of luck," or laugh out loud. "I'm rambling. I love my truck and just kicking it with my friends. I'm a good old country boy that loves to have fun." What having fun entailed last Labor Day afternoon, Tanner Brunson later testified, was to take his Blazer four-wheel driving in the riverbed. The Arkansas River runs right through the south side of Dodge City, Kansas. Among the attributes that might be expected of one of the Mississippi's major tributaries, it lacks only water. In much of southwestern Kansas, it has been bone dry for years, a condition that local people, not to speak of the state in a court case that lasted for decades, tend to blame on over-irrigation to the west. Colorado doesn't think Kansas needs any water. In Dodge, the Arkansas exists as a wide, flat bed of sparse grass and scrub brush with a channel of deep sand running down the middle. On what were the banks, there are, thanks to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, levees topped with some construction that calls to mind the German beach defenses in Normandy. One theory about why the river is dry in the Dodge City area is that the Corps of Engineers was called in to prevent a repetition of a devastating 1965 flood and did its job much too well. The riverbed has become a de facto recreation area. People go there to walk or jog or drive four-wheelers. Because of the levees, about all that is visible of the surrounding world is, here and there, the top of a grain elevator. It's peaceful in the riverbed, except for the occasional roar of a motorcycle or an off-road four-wheeler. Thus begins Calvin Trillin's 2010 piece in the New Yorker called Incident in Dodge City. And this is your reading for the coming week. I'm here at Wilson Park on the Emporia State campus, and there has been some music start up in the background. We will deal with that. Not much I can do about it. Hopefully it's not too distracting on the audio. But before reading Incident in Dodge City, I want to talk about, give you some background about what this story is all about, where it appeared, and some background on Calvin Trillin. Calvin Trillin was born in 1935 in Kansas City, Missouri, and since 1963, he has written for the New Yorker. Now, the New Yorker is one of the nation's premier magazines. Don't let the name fool you. It is centered in New York and central to New York. It has pieces about local pieces that are going on in New York, but it is one of the magazines of, well, not of record, but of major influence in the U.S. What is published in the New Yorker still matters. And Calvin Trillin is one of its foremost writers. Calvin Trillin occasionally returns to the Midwest to do pieces. This piece, for example, which he did in 2010, an earlier piece which he did in the 1980s, about the fried chicken wars down in southeast Kansas. If you've ever eaten at Chicken Mary's or Chicken Annie's down near Pittsburgh in Crawford County, then you know what I'm talking about. He did a fabulous piece about that. Here he turns more serious and he talks about a murder that occurred, well, a shooting that occurred in the riverbed of the Ark River. And of course, since I was reading his piece, since Calvin would have pronounced the river as Arkansas, I do as well, breaking my rule just to refer to it as the Ark River. Now, this is a complicated story. It's not a particularly difficult story to read, but it's a complicated story in that it's a story about, well, Dodge City. It's about race relations. It is about a jailhouse confession. It is about journalism because there's a journalist, Claire O'Brien, who goes and hears this jailhouse confession, and she writes a story in which race is implicated in the decision to file charges against the person who was the shooter. In this case, there are allegations of white supremacy. There's also a long history about the river and not a long history, but there are long descriptions, I should say, about the river. And Trillin does a great job of describing what the river looks like out there. And of course, last week we saw some of my pictures from that area, and including a picture underneath the 4th Street Bridge where this shooting took place. This incident has lasting implications for Kansas law because it was the inspiration for the Kansas Press Association and many newspapers, including the Dodge City Globe, to band together and to establish a shield law here in Kansas. And what a shield law does is shield journalists from having to turn over their notes and their other material that they've collected to authorities, to prosecutors, to the police, and others. There is no federal shield law. About half the states have shield laws, and Kansas got one shortly after the incident that Calvin Trillin is writing about here at Dodge City. And of course, Trillin is fascinated as well about the Wild West image of Dodge City and its history of violence in the Old West, its, well, celebration of violence with Front Street in the Boot Hill Museum complex. And this is why this piece appears in the New Yorker, because it strikes a chord in terms of cultural memory and stereotypes for the New Yorker readers. It's a very well-written piece. The piece appeared about a year after the shooting took place. And of course, the title refers to a very famous novel of the Old West called The Oxbow Incident, which is about, well, mob justice. And Trillin is riffing off of that title in his piece for the New Yorker. It's a very carefully written piece, lots of interviews, lots of observation. And Claire O'Brien, who is the reporter at the center of this piece that conducted the jailhouse interview and refused to surrender her notes or her tapes to the county prosecutor, it's really, she's an outsider. She hasn't worked very long for the Dodge City Globe. She's coming in and she's seeing the community as an outsider. And by the way, she did not last at the Dodge City Globe. She ended up leaving the Globe and pursuing some other journalistic pursuits. That's an incredibly bad line, which I would mark out in a student paper. Pursuing other journalistic opportunities, which included at one point coming to work for the Emporia Gazette a couple of years after this story was written, and her position at the Emporia Gazette only lasted a few days. So Claire O'Brien was very much out of place in Dodge City. She brought a little different perspective to it, to her work. I know the Dodge City Globe. It's a very small newspaper. I've interviewed the editor out there, or did interview the editor, 5 or 6 years ago, and including about this particular case and its legacy for Kansas journalism. What Trillin does really well is capture the sense of place. And of course, Dodge City is very similar to Emporia in that it has a large Hispanic population, many of them undocumented. And like Emporia, the Hispanic population comes to Dodge City to work in the meat processing plant. In both locations, there has been historically a Hispanic population before the meat processing plants came. And the Hispanic population came toward the end of the 19th and early 20th century to work on the railroads, true of both Emporia and Dodge City. And before that, there was a strong, especially in Dodge City, a strong Hispanic influence because at one time, Dodge City was part of, Mexican territory, or New Spain, that before the Louisiana Purchase, it was on the line, and of course it was on the Santa Fe Trail leading to one of the major metropolitan areas, or not metropolitan, but one of the major cities in Spanish territory, Santa Fe, and this is reflected in many towns across Kansas, and just even the names. You can see the names of the streets in Dodge City. Many of them have Spanish names, and even as far east as Coffeyville. Some cities have not plazas in the middle of their towns, not squares in the middle of their towns, but plazas, and this is a reflection of that Hispanic Southwestern influence. And of course, Dodge City has continued to be a flashpoint for race relations in Kansas. Most recently, it made headlines when the county clerk moved the polling place to vote in the general election and moved it outside of town, across the highway, to a place that was not easily accessible by those on foot, those who didn't have good transportation. And so there were many lawsuits filed over that. And this has been several years ago, not this last recent election, but in 2016. Now, I'm competing with the music. I don't know how much it's coming through on the recording, not too much, I hope. So do read the piece on the incident at Dodge City and typical response. And I want to know what your response is. If you're in terms of if you have a personal connection to Dodge City or someone out there, give me that. If you've got a personal response to the Hispanic population here in Kansas, that's fine too. I'm not looking for anything in particular in your response to this, other than just an honest response. Do pay attention to how well it's written and how it's structured, because we can learn a lot from that. But otherwise, not looking for anything in particular, other than an honest, well-written response from you on this. Let me talk about the research paper for just a bit. And the research paper, of course, has to be about a Kansas author, a Kansas title, or some way focusing on Kansas literature. And it's up to you what you find to do. You have to come up with your own idea. And as always, original ideas are the best. And as always, they are the most difficult to find. So I urge you to take a quick look at the literature, see what's out there, see what's been written about Kansas literature. Let me tell you, there's not a heck of a lot in terms of scholarly writing that's been done about Kansas literature, whether it's particularly not nonfiction. There is some about fiction and poetry, and you could do poetry as well if you would like. But if you think you have an original idea, take a look and see if anyone else has done it, see what kind of sources you can bring together, and see how well you can support your idea, because this is what I'll be looking for. I'm going to see how well you support your argument, how well you back up your thesis in the research paper. So find something that interests you. It's always better to write about something that interests you than something that doesn't. If you're bored with it, I'll be able to tell. So I would rather you write about something that you find engaging than rather you write about something that you will think will get you just a decent grade. And I encourage you to explore, think about ways of looking at it, and there's so many ways you can look at Kansas literature. You could look at a time period, you could look at a certain section in the state, you could look at a certain group of writers, you could look at a certain demographic of writers. All of that is fair game. You could look at one writer and explore that. You're not going to have the space to do anything that's too in-depth, or not in-depth, but too broad is what I'm saying. So narrower rather than broader is going to be better. For example, and don't use this for your research paper, but I just want to give you an example of the type of thing that I have in mind. That if you were doing a research paper on the work of Gordon Parks, there's so many things that you could do. You could look at his photography, you could look at his fiction, you could look at his nonfiction, all of that. And I'm going to include the photography would be fair game here. That does constitute Kansas literature as well. But you would have to narrow it down to one aspect of Parks's experience that you think really contributed to his writing, say, The Learning Tree and his film based on that. What was it about Parks's experience in Kansas? And he left fairly early for Minnesota, but what was it about growing up in Fort Scott that you can identify as a theme that runs through all of The Learning Tree and much else of what Parks wrote? And of course, racism would be one answer, but it has to be deeper than that. It's racism combined with, well, poverty, certainly. Racism combined with rural poverty. That would be part of it. Also, growing up in the time period he did, the challenges of the Depression, and also how large a family structure and all of that. So a place to start with Gordon Parks might be to look at that and think about what is it about Parks's experience that more than anything else informed his work. And I'll tell you what I think it is. I think it's a sense of injustice, that his outrage at the unfairness of the world is what made his work so compelling, whether we're talking about the films or the photojournalism or the novels or the nonfiction. That this is the thing that I think drives Parks. So if I were writing a research paper, I would concentrate on this outrage that Parks had about injustice. And of course, he chose to combat it with the pen, the camera, and music, but rather than turn to a knife or a gun. But there's several places where his outrage is apparent in his work. And many of these incidents were based on real-life incidents that happened to him in Kansas before he left. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. You could do something similar with the, not similar, but you could take the work of a poet, for example, and look at how the landscape influenced their writing, how the culture influenced their writing. Certainly you could do this with any number of Kansas poets, and next month is we'll be getting into poetry. Next month means next week for us, that we'll start taking a look at some Kansas poets to see how they've translated their experiences in the state. So do give me some idea of what you're going to do for the project paper. Drop me a note. Say, this is what I'm thinking about writing about. This is what I would like to approach, and here's my working thesis. Send me that, and I'll give you some feedback and let you know what I think. Now, just on a personal note, we are more than halfway through the semester. We may be coming toward the end of the pandemic. I hope so. I'm looking forward to seeing students in person again. Of course, this class is a online-only class. I have gotten to know many of you through your writing in this class, and that's good. But as we go forward from this, you should think about writing about the pandemic. What were your experiences during the pandemic? And also, you should think about reading about the pandemic, because the pandemic will create a new vein of literature, not just for Kansans, but for the entire country. And it will be a rich source of study for scholars. If you don't feel like writing about the pandemic, you don't have to, but if you're a scholar, if you're continuing your studies in English or another area, then the pandemic certainly is going to be a generational event. So it would be good to be one of the first to stake out this and stake out your territory and say, this is what I'm going to research and this is what I'm going to write about in terms of the pandemic. So, just an idea. Well, as always, I look forward to reading your work. I will end it here. I don't think I can compete with the music any longer. Hope it's not as loud on the audio as it is in my ears. Not that I don't like the music, it's just difficult to compete with. All right, well, happy spring, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.